All right, so Russia has invaded the Ukraine. Now, the two individuals on trigonometry, who are probably not um, unknown to many of you, I'm sure we're in some of the similar IDW space profile. One of these individuals is from Russia, and he's got family both in Russia and in Ukraine. And he has a little bit of analysis about what went on, and I thought it was helpful, so let's just listen to it.
So what he's saying is,
He's talking about Putin's big speech that he gave in anticipation of the Ukrainian invasion.
Russians, we gave you this stuff. We gave you this great culture, this land, these technological advancements, and you've squandered them. He spends 10 minutes talking about how Russia is corrupt. Not Russia, sorry. That was a Freudian slip. He talks about how Ukraine is corrupt, how it's run by oligarchs, how...
Is that true?
Of course it's true. Of course it's true.
But the same is true of Russia.
Well, of course it is, right? All of that world is run by oligarchs and is corrupt. I mean, would you say that the Western world is not run by oligarchs and is not corrupt? It is, right? Every country, to some extent, is run by oligarchs. The question is, does that justify their neighbor invading that country and taking over? That's really the conversation.
Now, as we listen to this, I want us to think about nationalism and what nationalism is, and how nationalism is an organizing principle between nations, a foundation of our identity. Notice that Putin begins with talking about Russian identity, and that basically Ukrainian identity, there's no identity there, so we just have to go into this land and restore order.
So he talks a lot about how Ukrainian education is poor and people are not looked after and the pensions are not great and gas prices have gone up and how terrible things are for people in Ukraine. So that's the second part of his speech, so the first part is explaining why Ukraine shouldn't exist. The second part is explaining why people in Ukraine are suffering, particularly Russian people and Russian speakers in Ukraine are suffering. And the third part of the speech, and this is the final part of the speech, and I don't understand why it hasn't been reported on. I mean, the first two parts are important because they tell you everything that's going to happen, right? If you don't believe Ukraine exists and you believe it is your historic mission to save the people in Ukraine who are of Russian ethnicity or Russian speakers from being abused by Ukrainian oligarchs, you always knew there was going to be an invasion. And you always knew it was never going to be limited to those two regions. Because when he talks about, well, you've glued on parts of Poland and parts of Hungary onto Ukraine, onto this Russian piece, that means that at least half of Ukraine, including the capital Kiev, is within the strike zone of what he wants to achieve. Right? There's no question about that. So the invasion will not stop in those two regions in the east unless it is stopped somehow by the West, which at this point is looking unlikely. But his intentions are not to stop with those two eastern regions. There's no question about that. Anyone who tells you otherwise either doesn't understand or wants it not to be true or whatever. But those are the facts, right? He is going to invade as much as he is allowed to, and he wants to invade at least up to Kiev and probably beyond, just in terms of that part of it. The third part of it, and the rationale for his invasion, is that he says that the West is meddling in the affairs of Ukraine. The West is meddling in the affairs of other Eastern European countries. The West is expanding NATO, which he says they say is a defensive alliance, but actually this is a way of putting rockets and missiles, and he goes through all the different rockets and missiles that the West already has and is developing. They want to put them all around Russia so that they could strike at the heart of Russia at any moment. So he is literally saying that Ukraine is planning an offensive against these eastern regions, which, some people in Ukraine are joking and going, yeah, we waited until Putin had 200,000 troops on the border. And then we were like, hey, let's do an aggressive action here. And the other thing that he says is essentially the West is about to attack. I mean, he doesn't mince words about it. He literally says that. He says the West is getting ready. It's putting nuclear and other sort of missiles in position to strike against us. And we must defend ourselves. Now, how you defend yourself by moving your borders closer to NATO, I don't really understand, but that is the argument.
And there's an argument there that that Nigel put forward is that the West, in particular America, has been antagonistic with putting these missile placements around the Russian border. And actually, if they'd been a little bit more conciliatory, this wouldn't have happened. Do you agree with that?
I think it's impossible to know. I don't personally agree with that. I think when I say you, I mean, I think people in the West forget the personal dimensions of this. You've got to understand that this paranoia about the West has always been a feature of the Russian mindset. It's
okay. So now we've got nationalism, we've got a Russian mindset.
It's not something that is going away. And if you could say, well, look, if the West had just stayed out of it, everything would be fine. That isn't true. I mean, the same way that Ukraine is being invaded now, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these are countries that have Russian-speaking minorities that can be weaponized in exactly the same way as the one in Ukraine is. These are countries that used to be part of the Soviet Empire after they were...
And by weaponized, he means that these Russian-speaking minorities could be armed and start to foment a civil war, which creates the pretext by which the Russians can come in and say, oh, you're persecuting this ethnic minority in your land, and so we're going to come and rescue them, which is exactly the playbook that they used in Ukraine.
Conquered and annexed by Stalin. While the Europe was busy with Hitler, Stalin took all of Eastern Europe basically for himself, including those countries. No, Russia was always going to try and expand. And this is what people in the West really don't understand is this isn't about NATO being aggressive, causing it. It's the West being weak that's causing it. The reason Vladimir Putin is doing this is he knows that the West is divided. The West is distracted. The West spends more time talking about pronouns than it does about things that matter.
Okay, now we should pay attention to power here, because one of the interesting things that we've been talking about for the last number of years is, to a degree, how postmodernity reduces everything to power, and that can be critiqued fairly well. And many of these individuals are doing it, but it's been interesting to see how the other side has also sort of reduced things to power. And, fair enough. I mean, I don't disagree with anything he just said about Putin. Putin took Ukraine because he pretty much figured, rightly so, that he could, and he will take as much as he is allowed to take. And the weakness of Western Europe in some ways invites Putin's aggression. I get all that, and I agree with it. But I think we have to think about this word and the use of this word power along the way.
And he's taken advantage of it, just like the Chinese are. See, people want to make this all about Vladimir Putin as this evil guy and he's gone crazy. He's not. He's not crazy. He's doing exactly what any sane leader in his position would do. Just like Xi Jinping is doing that in China. You see the West as weak. You do the things you've been planning to do for a long time.
That being the case, so we've got that.
Okay, so I'm gonna drop this here. So let's jump into the Jordan Peterson, Kurt Jamungal conversation about truth and lies and power, and begins with this story.
Article showing that, I think it was in the Virginia governor's race, that 4 people used tiki lanterns, and they were hypothetically marching in support of the
Tiki
Republican candidate. And so they were posing as members of the conspiratorial alt-right, but 2 of them were actually Democrat operatives, political operatives, trying to discredit the Republican campaign. And that's so dangerous because they're basically acting out the proposition that it's Nazis, for all intents and purposes, fascists that are supporting the Republicans. And
again, with Justin Trudeau's rhetoric surrounding the truckers' protest, we're seeing again this continued issue of the warping and misuse of language in order to try to achieve an end. Now we're going to have to get into the question of what are we trying to achieve? What end are we trying to achieve? And what is the motivation for this? And, I hear on the Joe Rogan podcast with, I can't remember the guy's name, Nazi, or I can play some clips, but I can't play any video, of course, because it's Joe Rogan. That it's all power. It's all power.
That's such a terrible lie, right? It's such a terrible lie to act that out, to demonize your fellow citizens that way. It's unbelievably dangerous, and we got to stop doing things like that, you know. And all of us have to stop doing things like that.
Right. That may be at the bottom of it. There's so many ways that this can be taken, and I think that it's difficult to say what's at the bottom, but one of the predominant factors may be personal lies, not personalize.
Yes, I believe that. I really do believe. Why do you say that?
Right. See, if you watch,
I really like this conversation. Peterson is very real and personable in this conversation, and Kurt is that way. I mean, when I did my conversation with Kurt, I didn't know who he was at all. It was just this random guy wanted to talk, and I get a lot of random guys who want to talk, and I usually say yes, and there was just all this chaos. He had to be somewhere else. We had a time difference, yada yada. But you watch enough. Somebody made the comment in the video I posted this morning about, Kurt is very much here. Kurt is very much here for the truth. He's not performing in these videos. He's exploring. It's Vervaekean dialogos, the best I can tell with Kurt. And I think that's part of the reason he's doing such a good job with his channel.
The film toward the fourth section, I believe I split it up into chapters, and in the fourth section it becomes much more philosophical, which was one of the reasons why I started it, because I happen to like puzzles and philosophy. It's one of the reasons I went into math. I like abstract thinking. So I tried to make a case about lies and how lies spread. Now there's one obvious route to take that with memes. So you talk about memes and how memes spread. So you don't want to pollute that, because that comes back to affect you if you care about yourself, first of all. So maybe you shouldn't care about yourself so much. As for, see, something I was exploring, and I'm not quite sure. Is it possible to tell a lie without lying to yourself? Now it seems on the face of it, yes.
I don't think so. Well, look,
now this is, can you hear that? Can you hear that car at the corner? Boom, 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 boom. Drives me crazy sometimes. I'm trying to record a video here. I love this section on lies. I thought, because, okay, so with Putin and Russia and, lies, what Putin's regime, again, I'm by no means an expert in any of this, but, I can't not think of Solzhenitsyn and Rod Dreher's Live Not by Lies.
Explain why it seems like
psychological evidence.
You
Well, there's psychological evidence, though, that you can't. Well, here, let's dig into that a little bit. So you tell a lie to yourself and you think, well, I know the difference. It's like, well, don't be so sure about that. So here's one experiment that's an example. So imagine that I give a group of people a scale that measures their political belief about a certain issue. Maybe the reality of climate change or the unreality of climate change, for that matter. It doesn't matter. And then I get those same people to write an essay of 500 words outlining the contrary position. And they know they're just doing it because it's part of the experiment. But then they come back a week later and I give them the same political belief scale. And what's happened is their beliefs will have shifted substantially towards the side that they argued for. Okay, so why? Well, first of all, a lot of your so-called beliefs are really low resolution. They're just heuristics. They're like single pixel images. You haven't thought it through very carefully.
This part is really good too. This is one of my favorite sections I've heard from Peterson in a long time here.
Carefully. Imagine maybe you know more than the average person because of your background, but imagine how much you know about how a helicopter works. Do you know what a helicopter is? Yes. No, you don't. If you had to draw one, it would look like a 4-year-old drew it. You know what it You can identify the shape in 2 dimensions. You know it flies. That's about it. You couldn't fix one. You certainly couldn't build one. So in a real sense, you don't know anything about a helicopter, except what you need as someone who's never around helicopters to know. And most things are way more complicated than helicopters, even though they're plenty complicated. And so you think that you know something when you think you know it, but then you detail out a counter argument. And it turns
now keep what he just said in mind about knowing to the whole Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, most of us, we hear it, we know it's tiny little bit. And of course, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine is magnitudes more complex than a helicopter. It is. The rest is history. Did a couple of podcasts on the Rus and the relationship between the Slavs and the Vikings and the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world and the slave trade and then the Mongol Empire and all of what happened in this. Putin's speech, an hour-long speech starts out with history. American presidents don't dare do that because Americans are like, huh? Netflix, change channel. It's not even a channel anymore. It's click off. I want 2 minutes, and I want 2 minutes that's just going to grab my emotions and incite an image that will give me a degree of emotional certainty about what is happening and what should go on there, even though, again, what's happening is orders of magnitude. Now, I'm not saying Putin is justified for invading Ukraine. I don't believe that for a moment. But we should respect something of what's going on here and our ignorance of it. It's not and ignorance is not necessarily another thing that strikes me is the participation that is just brought out of us. And we're going to talk about why that is a little bit. But again, think about this comment here with respect to Ukraine and Russia. Orders of magnitude more complex than a helicopter.
Turns out that you've provided more detail in the counter argument that you had in your argument to begin with. And so that shifts your cognition towards what you argued for. Well, if you think that...
Now, I interrupted it. Basically, if you're concocting a lie, you probably put more thought into the lie than you knew about the truth. Which means, in a sense, if you put the two things on a scale, the lie weighs a little bit more.
Doesn't happen to you when you're lying. Words that you had counter-argue know some helicopters, even though they're plenty complicated. And so you think that you know something when you think you know it, but then you detail out a counter-argument, and it turns out that you've provided more detail in the counter-argument that you had in your argument to begin with. And so that shifts your cognition towards what you argued for. Well, if you think that doesn't happen to you when you're lying, well, you don't know anything about how you work. And then the other thing is, well, virtually no one thinks that lying is acceptable morally when it comes right down to it. There might be specific exceptions to that now and then. And so if you lie, you're going to tilt what you believe towards the lie because that will lighten the ethical load that you carry. It'll reduce cognitive dissonance. That's one way of terming it. And then you can't keep track of your lies, and so that's a big problem, and they tangle up your thoughts. And then also, let's say a whole bunch of people really like your lie. Well, then, most of us, all of us, thrive on attention. I mean, children will misbehave to get attention, even if it's negative attention.
Did you remember seeing Putin in with all of his people in that giant room? And, well, we're going to decide if we're going to invade Ukraine. Oh, Art, is that what we're going to do together? Oh, so say we all. So say we all. Yeah, there's a lot of motivation going through things here.
If they can't get it any other way. And so you lie and you put it out on Twitter and, 10,000 people like it. And then you think, well, wait a sec. Probably I believe that because look at how positively it was received. And some of that's actually socially positive, right? I mean, if you say something and a lot of people respond to it positively, that might be a good reason for you to think that way a bit more, right? Because the fact that you want social approval isn't only an index of your cowardice, it's also an index of your desire to be productive and to fit in and to have people like you and all of that. And so lies, they just warp things to a tremendous degree. And if you think you're smart enough to keep your lies separate from your truth, and then one final issue is, well, let's say you lie 20% of the time. Well, doesn't that mean that you're practicing to become 20% a liar? And don't you think you're getting better at that? You become what you practice. And then don't you think that'll interfere with your ability to distinguish between what you think and what you don't think, first of all, and also your ability to tell the difference between truth and falsehood? And don't you think it'll make you cynical about the nature of humankind to observe yourself lying? You're certainly going to think other people do it, at least as much as you. And if they're bad people, they do it way more. It's just a rat's nest. And, you know, I became convinced a long time ago, looking at the totalitarian problem on the left and the right, that the most effective way to deal with this fundamentally was psychological, and that what we need to do, all of us, is to stop lying. Each of us, in our own lives. That's the solution. We have to stop. And that's because we're so damn powerful now. I mean, how many people have watched your podcasts, do you think?
There are millions.
How powerful might your lies be?
7 or 8 million.
Okay, so how powerful might your lies be?
Right.
Right? And I mean, each of those million people is connected to 1,000 other people.
And for me, this also came into the video I did before about deconstruction. So we've got Steve Skojec deconstructing from his traditional Catholicism. We've got Tierra Forte deconstructing from his evangelical Christianity. Given the internet, we've got so much information flowing at us at a rate like we never had before. I am old enough to remember life before the internet. And you know what? If you wanted to look up even just a little factoid or detail or just fact check something, you had to go to the library and either get into the reference section of periodicals and start looking something up, or you had to go to the card catalog, or you had to find someone who might know, and you had to go through all the rigmarole to ask them. Now I just pull out my cell phone and Google it. The world has changed, and to imagine that none of this will disrupt the systems and establishments of thought that we have, it's simply inconceivable. Of course it will. So, and then to figure out truth from lying, of course, I mean, everything that Peterson just talked about has everything to do with sincerity. Now, sincerity doesn't say much about the factuality of the knowledge that you possess, but rather the fact that you believe it to be true. So there's a whole nother thing to throw into this mix. And so, yeah, life is challenging right now in a lot of different ways.
So that's a billion people that you're 2 steps away from, at least. So you said 7 million people. So it's 7 billion people. You know, I mean, obviously those circles are going to overlap, but you get my point.
Yeah. What I would object to is that you said most people would agree that telling lies is deleterious in some manner. Now I'd say that they profess it, but they don't truly believe it. And and that may in fact be what unifies the extremes. I'll give you an example. Sure. If you ask someone, I think that if you were to ask someone, is it okay to lie for the greater good? They would say, well, the majority of those people on the extremes would say yes. And then I want
now, and of course, during COVID, we've had a lot of lying for the greater good, presumably on behalf of people who people who want our best interest for us. Well, maybe I can play some of that in here. Okay, this is from Joe Rogan and Majid Nawaz, the podcast that was recently out, and I thought it was quite good. BJ Campbell posted a thing on it, and of course I can't show you the video because I don't want this taken down, but let's go ahead and play some.
I'm also talking about people that have accepted a certain narrative and find that there's a lot of other people that are along with them in this same narrative, and they have these media pylons, like social media pylons, where they'll attack people and, like you, call you an anti-vaxxer even though you've been vaccinated. The same thing with Eric Clapton. They were angry at Eric Clapton because he spoke openly about his very extreme vaccine side effects, just speaking openly as a person who was vaccinated, and they called him a vile anti-vaxxer.
Well, the question is why, right? And it's to shut debate down.
Yes.
Now, why would you want to shut debate down? I think there's a deeper point here, and that is that we've just come out of a time where, for a long time, moral and, let's just say, relativism, whether it's moral or otherwise, relativism, this idea that truth is relative, this idea that that it's all subjective, that everything is personal experience, that's being promoted. Yeah, there's no such thing as reality, whether it comes down to defining a man or woman. We spoke about this last time I was here with well, it was there in California, but with Sam as well. We spoke about the trans debate and man and woman. Whether it's defining a man and a woman, whether it's anything else, this idea that actually truth is all personally subjective.
Right.
When you promote the idea that there's no such thing as truth, and when you shut down debate that is seeking truth, not that it claims truth, but is seeking it, when you shut that debate down in aid of this idea that truth is relative.
Now, of course, this is different from lying, because I get annoyed sometimes when people use the word lying when they're talking about someone who is simply wrong, or someone who misspeaks. My definition of a lie is to consciously distort the truth for the sake of some other agenda you're pursuing.
Like those, for example, who now know the science that the COVID vaccination doesn't stop or doesn't stop infection or transmission and doesn't reduce it beyond 12 weeks. The booster shot, by the way, is 8 weeks. But having known that, and they still insist on vaccine passports, it's no longer about seeking the truth for them. The truth is relative and it serves a purpose. What happens when you do that? When there's no such thing as truth, you can't define reality. And when you can't define reality, the only thing that matters is power. You're a father. Now, we're your children who can't reason, like my kid's 5. I mean, his reasoning abilities are great, but he's 5, right? It's why you say to the child, because I said so, do it. It's good for you. Because they don't know how to reason yet. Yeah. And you try, and if something's too complex, you say, I'll explain another time, but right now you have to listen to your father. Don't do this. When there's no such thing as truth, because everything's relative, the only thing that matters is power, because power gets to define reality. And this brings us to the hybrid war we're in right now. And that's why people that are in power who are seeking a specific outcome.
Now this is where BJ Campbell, with his egregore conversation, begins to talk about and push back on Nawaz to a degree, and I think he's right to do so. People in power, first of all, it's terribly vague, as if they're all together, but there are powers that are dominating, and the people in power don't necessarily have to have ill intent in order to, let's say, lie to achieve something. Now, it's very difficult to lie, I suppose, if you don't believe that truth exists, but I frankly do not believe that many people can actually pull that off, because it's really quite difficult.
From the world that we're in, want to shut debate down. What they're not interested in is seeking truth. What they're interested in is shutting that debate down, because power steps into that void when reason no longer exists and gets to define reality for you from up above.
Okay, now, and I'm going to continue to play more about power and the Jordan Peterson thing, and that critique of power, I think, holds to this one too. To say that all men simply want to shut down women and control their bodies, well, why? Because power. No, there's not that much fun in it. That bulverism is simply insufficient to explain everything. In fact, there might be some people that are into that, and Peterson has a nice section in that in the video's conversation with Kurt about psychopaths. But so here's sort of the IDW space, narrative B on the COVID, but you watch, so Trigonometry, Majid, Nawaz, they're starting to play the power card too. And you really have to be careful with this card, because there's something else that's really going on besides this.
And it's why it's so important in a dictatorship that the only thing you have left when all your power is taken from you is the truth. And if you read Orwell, if you look at 1984, it's why he spends so much time talking about how the power he was writing about in that fictional account is attempting to redefine reality, redefine the past, redefine the future. Because if you can't hold on to reality, you have no premise to scrutinize the government for whether they're telling you the truth or not. And it is a war in that sense, hybrid war. So information in that war becomes your most powerful weapon. Now, most people don't have the privilege of researching these debates, foreign policy, war on terror, COVID, whatever it is. People don't have the privilege because they're working 9 to 5, a minimum wage, and they're hungry and they're just busy trying to live and survive. What they normally do is they outsource their thinking on where the truth lies to trusted voices in the media.
All right, authority structures, and it might be in the media, and in fact, they might be disconnected from the media, because our authorities generally function as authorities overall. And this is the reason we trust our parents. Now, we might differ from our parents, and we might reject our parents' politics or embrace our parents' politics, but because our parents have shown themselves to be generally trustworthy if they raised you well, and if they sacrificed on your behalf, and if they did things for you, then your parents are considered to be trusted. They might be misinformed, and they might be misguided, but at least they're not lying, because they have demonstrated over the course of years by their own sacrifice for your well-being that they are for you. So you outsource your knowing to trusted authorities.
So it's why it becomes so important to manipulate the media, so that those trusted voices that people are looking to are no longer giving them at least the best understanding of the truth they have.
But again, I think he oversells it. Certainly there is manipulation of the media. Certainly there is lying, but there is also simply passing along the narratives that you believe in,
but are also peddling the agenda of power. When you're in a situation like that, it becomes difficult to define reality, and therefore difficult to challenge government on whether or not they are sticking to their promises, because everything gets shifted. Everything's relative. The Overton window keeps moving. The goalposts keep shifting.
Okay, that's far enough in that one. Let's go back to Peterson here and Kurt Jamungal.
Wonder, well, perhaps that's an indication that you're on the extreme. Perhaps if you have a worldview, I talk about this concept called Weltanschauung.
That's a good idea, man.
Yeah, perhaps if you have a Weltanschauung that says that somehow you can't tell a lie and be for the greater good, because the truth and the good are tied.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think that's a really smart idea. The idea that if you have a belief system politically that requires any lies to support, then that's an indication that you've gone too far. I think that's a good rule of thumb.
Right. And what else is...
And that's a good rule of thumb for the left and the right.
Mentioned, it's pestiferous because it's poisonous, is that they'll say power is they'll say power is the predominant, perhaps only factor that underlies our social interactions and even truth claims and so on. Well, the issue with that is that it's partly true. And the reason is, see this cup here. This cup comprises many elements. There's an element of power in this cup.
This has become sort of the basic. This is the tip of the spear for this corner of the internet, the realization that the cup is between us, as Vervaeke says in the Four Horsemen of Meaning. It's transjective, the graspedness, and all of this stuff that we've talked about before. It's the pattern that Peugeot says to Michaela at the beginning of their conversation. It's folded into that as combinatorial explosiveness. Combinatorial explosiveness holds even for the cup. Now, that sounds tremendously skeptical, but it turns out not so much. There's certainly humility we need to have about it, but it isn't that we can't know anything or that we don't know enough to actually engage with the cup or engage with the manipulables that I talked about in my question and answer today.
There's an element of art as well, by the way. There's an element of physics. You can look at it mathematically. You can look at it through an engineering lens. You can look at it through an architectural lens.
Yeah, well, the power in the cup is, for example, that you own it. It's your cup. Right? And so it's embedded within a hierarchy. Now, so your claim is exactly right. But there's a huge difference between claiming that it's useful to investigate the role that arbitrary expression of power plays in conceptual systems, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say, and the premature answer that the solution to the problem of perception is will to power and nothing else. And so I've been talking to some evolutionary biologists about that. I talked to Robert Trivers this week. He's getting old, and it was interesting to...
So that'll be another video that isn't out yet, but probably, I mean, I don't know who Trivers is. Brett Weinstein, he was a mentor for Brett Weinstein, and Brett Weinstein speaks the world of him, and Peterson got a chance to talk to him. We'll see how that conversation goes.
Talk to him, but we talked about psychopaths. Okay, so let's wander down that path just for a minute. So imagine that the patriarchal structure is predicated on nothing but power. Okay, and then imagine that psychopaths are particularly cunning users of power. Okay, so then to the degree that the social system is an expression of power, you'd expect psychopaths to be radically successful. But they, in human population...
Temporarily successful. Yeah.
Well, they also never exceed. Their numbers vary between 1% and 5% in the population. Never gets higher than 3 is really the upper limit, but it can get up to 5. So they're not that successful because 97% of people aren't psychopaths. So just that fact alone indicates that there's something wrong with the power claim. Now, you might say, well, psychopaths aren't very good at utilizing power. It's like, no, wait a minute. Actually, psychopaths are better at utilizing pure power, stripped completely of empathy, than anyone else by definition. So they are literally the power users who lack compassion. So why aren't they radically successful in human populations? And the answer to that is, well, because our hierarchies are not fundamentally built on power, and our concepts and perceptions aren't fundamentally a consequence of power or its misuse. Now, that doesn't mean that our perceptions and our social structures can't be, and our intimate relationships, our relationships with ourselves for that matter, can't become contaminated by the excess desire for power and by the deceit that might be employed, let's say, in its service. That obviously that happens, and we have to keep our eyes open all the time about that. But the central claim is, not only is it unbelievably cynical and destructive, and also extremely helpful if you want to demonize your enemies. You know, because if I believe that the entire basis of your perceptual structure is will to power, and
this is part of my pause when I listened to Maajid Nawaz on Joe Rogan, is he keeps going back to the stuff, and it's like, no, I agree with BJ Campbell. It's not that the leaders are simply there desiring power and control. Why do they desire power and control? get that in a minute. We'll finish this clip.
So is mine, let's say. Well, if you don't believe the same things I do, so if you're trying to elevate yourself in a different hierarchy, or you're trying to produce a different hierarchy altogether, we have nothing in common except our enmity. Because there's no ground outside what you're striving for and what I'm striving for selfishly where we can meet as reasonable people and have a, soul-to-soul discussion.
And I would, sort of jump on Vervaeke's bandwagon about reason, that meet as reasonable people. What on earth do we mean by that? Well, to, again, reinforce the point that Peterson is making here, we're having a common language. We have enough commonality in goal. Maybe we can have a win-win. And so you look at Europe and it's like, well, maybe if we don't have a war, we can have win-win. And to some degree, the West thought, oh, surely they're on the same page as us. Well, apparently not so much. Okay? Not so much with Putin. And now Europe is going to have to recalculate its defense budgets and its priorities, and very well, Putin's move might give him what he doesn't want, which is a Europe that rearms and stiffens itself, because, the United States has two oceans to think about, and it's in the other side of the world looking at China and Taiwan and Korea and all of those interests. So, Europe's going to have to put on their big boy pants and decide if they're going to look deep into Putin's eyes. Well, didn't help George W. Bush too much, because saw into his soul. Not so much. So let's let Peterson finish.
That's not even technically possible within that scheme. And so that means that if you and I are enemies, well, what am I supposed to do with you? Because all you are is will to power. I can't trust you. I can't reason with you. Reason doesn't even exist. You see echoes of that in the claims that rational discussion or something like that is, especially the dialectical forms, is somehow a construction of white supremacy, implicit in our social structures. It's so shallow, that idea. And the idea that our virtues, first of all, that there aren't any virtues, but even if there are, they're only derivable from power hierarchy structures. God, that's so cynical and so destructive and so dangerous. And imagine just living with that notion that that's what motivates everyone, is nothing but like an untrammeled will to authoritarian power. God, that's hell, man.
Yeah, you mentioned the word use multiple times, and that is one of the reasons why I try to analyze it more philosophically toward the end, because I don't think that this is, some people would say what we need is dialogue. You'll hear this many of the times. It would come from people who are on the center right, center left. They'll say, we just need to speak to each other more. But I think what comes prior to speaking is we need to value the same. We need to be oriented in the same direction.
Yeah, well, that's again what this new book that I'm writing is about, because there has to be an initial framework, as you said, that makes even the possibility of dialogue a reality. So it's got to be something. Look at what we're doing right now, you and me. Hopefully this is what we're doing, right?
Yeah,
is like,
hopefully.
you know some things and I know, yeah, that's right, man, hopefully. And let's bloody well pray that we are smart enough and wise enough and careful enough to do it, right? So,
which is not easy.
You come to this discussion thinking maybe you don't know everything and that I might have something to say that would be useful and interesting to you, that might actually be crucial to you. And I come to this dialogue hoping for the same from you, right? So first of all, we both come, to the degree we're doing this properly, in an attitude of humility. I want to hear from you. And, I tend to be kind of dominant in conversations and I talk too much. And so that probably interferes with it to some degree, but I really do try to listen. And I really do hope that when I talk to someone, that's partly why I do the podcast, is that they'll tell me something that someone as stupid and potentially malevolent as me might really need to know. And so,
You sound like a Calvinist, my friend.
so if I listen real carefully, maybe they won't even know what it is that I need to know that they know. But if I listen very carefully, I can kind of call it out of them, and then I can use that information to correct myself so I don't do something catastrophically stupid in the future and hurt myself and the people I love. And so you have to have this presumption of ignorance, And the belief that the person across from you, particularly if they differ from you, might have something useful to say because they're different from you. They know things that you don't know. So isn't it so good that they're different? And then you have to believe that men of goodwill exist, let's say, and that they can exchange information that's mutually corrective and both can walk away better. And that's something like faith. It's faith. Well, I think it's equivalent. I think it's equivalent to, in the Christian sphere, it's equivalent to the faith in Logos. It's the same thing. And Logos is a very complicated concept.
One of the reasons, and I'm not quite sure why this is the case, but one of the reasons this Theories of Everything podcast has taken off the way that it has.
Okay, we'll pause it there. I want to get into what people are looking for. The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. This book was written in 1951. I first heard about this book when I was talking to my friend Neil Hand. Gosh, I miss Neil Hand. When I first came to the church here, it wasn't called Living Stones then. It was Sacramento Christian Reformed Church. I was interviewing for the job, and I was sitting in a restaurant with the good people of the church then, and they told me about this strange man in the church who had A's and B's in the church. And the A's were the people who had grown up in the Christian Reformed Church, and the B's were the people who hadn't. And he had a little insurance business, and he had a map on the wall of where they all lived, and he studied the A's and B's, and he even wrote a paper, and he kind of upset the people of the church that he categorized them. But Neil Hand had gotten a degree in Berkeley on anthropology, and he, for a long time, was the opera music buyer for Tower Records when Tower Records was in its heyday. And he was an unusual man, and he was a delight. And he had been an alcoholic, and almost everything I learned about AA, I learned from Neil Hand. And so he had wrecked his life on alcohol. And then he had found AA, and it had sobered, and he got sober through it, and he worked the program for like 25 years. And at the end of those years, he said, I need something that goes beyond AA. And so he found this strange little church on this sort of town, and this side of town, and he loved this little church, and nobody ever quite knew what to do with Neil. And he was big as a mountain, Neil was. And Neil was someone in this church that I could talk about philosophy and culture and politics and all these kinds of things with, because he was a very intelligent man, and he had read so many things, and he was constantly reading, and he loved opera, and he loved classical music. When he died, he left something like 14,000 records that his poor widow had to deal with, and she was hoping she could get some money out of it. She couldn't get much, and about as many CDs and about as many books, and had an entire room in that house that was just full. Some of his addictive personalities that drove him to drink initially drove him to collect all sorts of other things that didn't make any sense, but he was a lovely, wonderful, delightful person that I loved so much, and then I buried him. He was the one that told me about this book, The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, because Neil was quite a bit older. Neil was about my father's age, so he's a generation older, and would take me out to lunch, and we'd talk about ideas and all sorts of things. And he didn't have a lot of people he could talk about those things to, so he would call me up in the middle of the day, and he'd be getting insurance phone calls. He just, "Hi, this is Neil. Can I call you back?" Because he just wanted to talk to me. Oh, we had so much fun. We were such good friends, and I miss him so much. But he introduced me to this book. And this, if you've never read this book, which I haven't read this book, remember he introduced it to me, so I picked up a used copy of it, and I'd looked in the book, and I'd read little snatches of the book here and there, and I always thought I should get back to it. And then when I talked to B.J. Campbell recently, he mentioned the book again. I thought, yeah, I gotta finally wrestle this one to the ground. Its time has come for me. And yeah, this is a good one. You can find a little summary of it on Wikipedia. what he tries to do in this book is to distill what mass movements have in common. In some ways, it's sort of analogous to the study of propaganda, let's say. To find what mass movements have in common regardless of the contents of their movement. So he was a social philosopher. And it's an ambitious book, and there's plenty of pushback. Again, the book was written in 1951 after the Second World War, and of course nationalism fits very much into this. This book deals with some peculiarities common to all mass movements, be they religious movements, social revolutions, or nationalist movements. It does not maintain that all movements are identical, but that they share certain essential characteristics which give them a family likeness. All mass movements generate in their adherents a readiness to die and a proclivity for united action. All of them, irrespective of the doctrine they preach and the program they project, breed fanaticism, enthusiasm, fervent hope, hatred, and intolerance. All of them are capable of releasing a powerful flow of activity in certain departments of life. All of them demand blind faith and single-hearted allegiance. I was looking at the little, I'll pull it up, this little video of the leader of Ukraine and his government. They're ducking the Russians, and I don't even know what they're saying in it, but basically he's saying, we're still in Kyiv, we're holding firm. I mean, this is powerful stuff. And you find people who perhaps have had zero interest in Ukraine now move just understanding. Think of Peterson and the helicopter again, just a glimpse of this. And wow, don't you want to just go there and be a part of it? And you know right now that, we talked about what men desire. You know that there are men all over the world right now that see this and something stirs in them and they want to go to Kyiv and they want to fight there. They don't care if it's their fight or not. This is meaning. It's the source of life. Mass movements. All movements, however, different in doctrine and aspiration, draw their early adherents from the same types of humanity. They appeal to the same types of mind. Though there are obvious differences between fanatical Christian, the fanatical Mohammedan, middle of 20th century, that's the word they used, the fanatical nationalist, the fanatical communist, and the fanatical Nazi. 1951, the Second World War wasn't yet cold. It is yet true that the fanaticism which animates them may be viewed and treated as one. The same is true of the force that drives them to the expansion and world dominion. There is a certain uniformity in all types of dedication, of faith, of pursuit of power, of unity, of self-sacrifice. There are vast differences in the contents of holy causes and doctrines, but certain uniformity in the factors which make them effective. He who, like Pascal, finds precise reasons for the effectiveness of Christian doctrine has also found the reasons of the effectiveness of communist, Nazi, and nationalist doctrine. However different the holy causes people die for, they perhaps die basically for the same thing. Now, again, there's plenty that you can critique in there. He's not saying that all of them are identical. He's saying that there's something in us that can be triggered by a variety of causes, good and bad. Snake Island outside of Odessa, for example. I mean, just, F the Russians. Go ahead and kill me. I mean, there again, as we talked about in the rise and fall of Mars Hill with James Wellman and Tripp, there's something that moves, especially, not, you say women don't have that. Of course they do, but boy, men got it. This book concerns itself chiefly with the active revivalist phase of mass movements. This phase is dominated by the true believer, the man of fanatical faith who is ready to sacrifice his life for a holy cause, and an attempt is made to trace his genesis and outline its nature. Now, I'm not going to read all of this, but I very much wanted to get into a section on why. Because, again, we're talking about power, and we see again and again, well, it's power. And trigonometry says, no, we've got to have power. And Majid says, it's leaders and their power. But, Peterson is correct with his critique. Psychopaths would rule the world, but they don't. And I still haven't touched that great section with Joe Rogan where Peterson basically says, no, it's, rule over hell. No, everyone is animated by something. Everyone is animated by a vision. First here he talks about mass movements involved in the realization of a vast, rapid change are revolutionary and nationalistic singly or in combination. Peter the Great was, okay. There's something here that you've got individual, and the question and answer today, someone brought up Plato's Republic and this smooth move that Plato makes, Socrates makes between the individual and the city. And we don't think about that move as much as we should. See, I don't know if these are Vervaeke hands or these are PVK hands. Maybe they're Muppet hands. Anyway, in the past, religious movements were the conspicuous vehicles of change. The conservatism of a religion, its orthodoxy, is the inert coagulum of a once highly reactive sap. A rising religious movement is all change and experience, open to new views and techniques from all quarters. Islam, when it emerged, was an organizing and modernizing medium. Christianity was a civilizing and modernizing influence among the savage tribes of Europe. The Crusades and the Reformation both were crucial factors in shaking the Western world from the stagnation of the Middle Ages. Be a little careful with that one in this little corner of the internet, but this is 1951. In modern times, the mass movement involved in the realization of the vast and rapid change are revolutionary and nationalist, singly or in combination. Peter the Great was probably the equal in dedication, power, and ruthlessness of many of the most successful revolutionary or nationalist leaders. Yet he failed in his chief pursuit, which was to turn Russia into a Western nation. And the reason he failed was that he did not infuse the Russian masses with a soul-stirring enthusiasm. Why did Jordan Peterson do what he did? Because that's exactly what he did to a certain group, to infuse them with a soul-stirring enthusiasm to clean their room and beyond. Either did not think it necessary or did not know how to make his purpose a holy cause. It is not strange that the Bolshevik revolutionaries who wiped out the last of the czars and the Romanovs should have a sense of kinship with Peter, a czar and a Romanov, for his purpose is now theirs, and they hope to succeed where he failed. The Bolshevik Revolution may figure in history as much as an attempt to modernize a sixth of the world's surface as an attempt to build a communist economy. The fact that both the French and the Russian revolutions turned into nationalist movements seems to indicate that in modern times nationalism is the most copious and durable source of mass enthusiasm. We're feeling it right now with Ukraine, aren't we? I'm not going to say that when I read Snake Island or when I see those leaders standing in Kyiv, knowing that the Russians are looking for them and the Russians will win that war. Whether they'll win the occupation is another story. We learned that in Iraq, but just seeing those guys stirs me. And, go home and say, honey, I might be 58 years old and not in terribly great shape, but I'm... Ugh. Yeah, that wouldn't wash with my wife. Honey, I'm going to go fight for Ukrainian freedom. I mean, the Spanish, the war against fascism in Spain, the Spanish Revolution in the, between the wars. I mean, Hemingway went there. I mean, people went, Orwell went there. People went there. And that's where Orwell was disillusioned. One wonders whether the difficulties encountered by the present Labour government in Britain, again, this is 1951, are not partly due to the fact that the attempt to change the economy of the world and the way of life for 49 million people has been initiated in an atmosphere singularly free from fervor, exaltation, and wild hope. The revulsion from the ugly patterns developed by most contemporary mass movements has kept the civilized and decent leaders of the Labour Party shy of revolutionary enthusiasm. The possibility still remains that events might force them to make use of some mild form of chauvinism, so that in Britain, too, the socialization of the nation might have as its natural corollary the nationalization of socialism. The phenomenal modernization of Japan would probably not have been true without the revival spirit of Japanese nationalism. It is perhaps also true that the rapid modernization of some European countries, Germany in particular, was facilitated to some degree by the upsurge and thorough diffusion of nationalist fervor. Judged by present indications, the Renaissance of Asia will be brought about through the instrumentality of nationalist movements rather than by other mediums. There is in us a tendency to locate the shaping power of our existence outside of ourselves. Success and failure are unavoidably related in our minds and the state of things around us. Hence, it is that people with a sense of fulfillment think it a good world and would like to conserve it as it is, while the frustrated favor radical change. The tendency to look for a cause outside ourselves persists, even when it is clear that our state of being is the product of personality, of personal qualities such as ability, character, appearance, health, and so on. If anything ail a man, says Thoreau, so that he does not perform his functions, if he have a pain in his bowels even, he forthwith sets about reforming the world. It is understandable that those who fail should incline to blame the world for their failure. The remarkable thing is that the successful too, however, much they pride themselves in their foresight, fortitude, thrift, and other sterling qualities, are at bottom convinced that their success is the result of a fortuitous combination of circumstances. The self-confident of even the consistently successful is never absolute. They are never sure that they know all the ingredients which go into the making of their success. The outside world seems to them a precarious balanced mechanism, and so as long as it ticks in their favor, they are able to tinker with it. Thus the resistance to change and the ardent desire for it spring from the same conviction, and the one can be as vehement as the other. Discontent by itself does not invariably create a desire for change. Other factors have to be present before discontent turns into disaffection. One of these is a sense of power. Those who are awed by their surroundings do not think of change, no matter how miserable their condition. Now, I like this because this awe is what Peterson is drumming on in terms of worship. Awe, aspiration, imitation. I don't know that he's spoken with Richard Dawkins yet. He was in the UK. Maybe he did it then, and we haven't heard the recording. I don't know. When our mode of life is so precarious as to make it patent that we cannot control the circumstances of our existence, we tend to stick to the proven and the familiar. We counteract a deep feeling of insecurity by the making of our existence a fixed routine. We thereby acquire the illusion that we have tamed the unpredictable. Fisher folk, nomads, and farmers who have to contend with the willful elements, the creative worker who depends on inspiration, the savage awed by his surroundings, they all fear change. They face the world as they would an all-powerful jury. The abjectly poor, too, stand in awe of the world around them and are not hospitable to change. It is dangerous life we live when hunger and cold are at our heels. There is thus a conservatism of the destitute as profound as the conservatism of the privileged, and the former is as much a factor in the perpetuation of a social order as the latter. Something to think about when people are talking about privilege. The men who rush into undertakings of vast change usually feel they are in possession of some irresistible power. The generation that made the French Revolution had an extravagant conception of the omnipotence of man's reason and the boundless range of his intelligence. Never, says de Tocqueville, had a humanity been prouder of itself, nor had it ever had so much faith in its own omnipotence. Out of the Enlightenment. And joined with this extravagant self-confidence was a universal thirst for change that came unbidden to every mind. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who plunged recklessly into the chaos of the creation of a new world, had blind faith in the omnipotence of Marxist doctrine. The Nazis had nothing as potent as that doctrine, but they had faith in an infallible leader and also faith in a new technique. For it is doubtful whether National Socialism would have made such rapid progress if it had not been for the electrifying conviction that the new techniques of blitzkrieg and propaganda made Germany irresistible. Even the sober desire for progress is sustained by faith. Faith in the intrinsic goodness of human nature and in the omnipotence of science. It is a defiant and a blasphemous faith, not unlike that held by the men who set out to build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and who believe that nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Offhand, one would expect that the mere possession of power would automatically result in a cocky attitude towards the world and a receptivity to change, but it is not always so. The powerful can be as timid as the weak. What seems to count more than possession of an instrument of power is faith in the future. Now, he's writing in 1951. This also has to deal with decadence that Duthout writes about in his excellent book. When the power is not joined with a faith in the future, it is used mainly to ward off the new and preserve the status quo. On the other hand, extravagant hope, even when not backed by actual power, is likely to generate a most reckless daring. For the hope, Leroy Jenkins. For the hopeful can draw strength from the most ridiculous source of power, a slogan, a word, a button. No faith is potent unless it is a faith in the future, unless it has a millennial component. So as an effective doctrine, as well as being a source of power, it must also claim to be the key to the book of the future. Those who would transform a nation or a world cannot do so by breeding and captaining discontent or by demonstrating the reasonableness and desirability of the intended changes or by coercing people into a new life. Part of the reason Marxism failed and they all complained, these Western people are just too fat and happy to rise up and grab the means of production. They must know how to kindle and fan an extravagant hope. That's what I want to highlight, because there's the key. This extravagant hope. It matters not whether it be true of a heavenly kingdom or a heaven on earth, of plunder and untold riches, of fabulous achievement or world domination. If the communists win Europe and a large part of the world, remember this is 1951, it would not be because they know how to stir up discontent or know how to infect people with hatred. Isn't this what they always say? Well, you're infected with hatred. That doesn't mean winning for the communists, but because they know how to preach hope. There are hopes generating people, not simply some love of power. Doesn't make sense, doesn't hold true. The power is always in service of some vision for the future, whether it be this earth or the next, whether it be, it's an extravagant hope that drives people to do the reckless thing, that drives people to want to have the great reset or remake the world. It's an extravagant hope. That's what stirs us. But it's a combination of all these coming together. Oh, I'm a Leroy Jenkins all the way to Ukraine and, die a strange, pitiful man, like how many people who rushed to Syria or to Afghanistan because of that vision. Well, there was extravagant hope, and this is where religions, of course, in many ways are so potent and powerful because they can offer, their palette is so much broader. Part of the reason Putin is acting as he is and doing some of the reading and a little bit of what I've done in the last few weeks is that his population is declining. He has them under his thumb, and as what he should have learned from the Soviet Union, people without much hope, they don't really do necessarily a lot of things. Now, you can mobilize them and strive and make them strive with nationalism, but a lot of these things don't really pan out very well. Nationalism burns for a while, but then when you learn that your leaders are in it for themselves, well, that ardor wanes. Seeing the leaders of the Ukraine might make us burn hot, but what if, like Mark Driscoll, they're not worthy of our devotion? So often we find that the leaders can't really come through with what they asked. And this is part of the reason religions are so enduring and they work so well, because their palette is far broader and they can paint with such vivid colors. And especially with historical religions, you can use nostalgia and all sorts of things in the past to mobilize things in the future. This is why the atheists are not going to win. They simply cannot. Now, again, this isn't saying that I'm not making a point about the truth of one religion over another. Now, I think, back to Peterson, I think if you have to have lie in with your religion, it's not going to stand. And this is why, well, people are deconstructing, and hopefully they will reconstruct into a better religion and into a better place when they find that the leaders of the past had clay feet. So, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And my time is done. Got to get home to my lovely wife, and we will have a lovely Friday evening dinner. And that's enough for today. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you think.